Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Melbourne Writers' Festival. It is such a pleasure to be here. My name is Sally Warhaft. It's an extra pleasure because this session today is brought to you with the Melbourne Writers' Festival by the Wheeler Centre, where I've been doing the Fifth Estate there for almost the whole 15 years that they've been around. So the Writers' Festival's, I know, very grateful for that partnership, as is Wheeler. It's a terrific panel today that we have here at this gorgeous theatre on these beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I'd like to particularly welcome all the elders that are here today. I love elections. I love absolutely everything about them. I'm the only person in the room that doesn't want them extended to 4 years. That time every year when the citizenry is the main character, the star of the show, and the voices of ordinary people are heard loud and clear, as they were last Saturday night in our distinctive democracy. On the Sunday morning after every Saturday night of every election, the phrase "out of touch" is usually to be heard, the sad obituary for the loser, whoever they are. How our voices are heard and how we connect as citizens between elections is one of the subjects that we're going to talk about today. What are our responsibilities beyond the compulsory vote? And how does our national identity fit into all of this? Luckily, we have a trio of outstanding citizens to talk about this topic. Emeritus Professor Judith Brett is a political historian, an essayist, and the author of many books, including Robert Menzies' Forgotten People, The Enigmatic Mr. Deacon, Secret Ballot to Democracy Sausage, and her latest book, Fearless Beatrice Faust, which is a biography of the woman who founded the Women's Electoral Lobby. Thomas Mayo is a signatory and leading advocate of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, an essayist and the author of 5 books, including Finding the Heart of the Nation, the Voice to Parliament Handbook, which he wrote with Kerry O'Brien, and Always Was, Always Will Be, which asks what's next after the failed 2023 Voice to Parliament referendum. And Cathy McGowan, who was the original community candidate. She won the seat of Indy in 2013 after it was held for 82 years by the Coalition. Cathy became the exemplar of the community-led kitchen table campaigns. Her book, Cathy Goes to Canberra, tells that story and what it's really like to negotiate with the major parties in Canberra. So give our fabulous panel a big welcome. Last Saturday night, let's start with what happened and what each of you think was the most interesting thing that happened as a collective act of citizenry. And Cathy, I'll start with you.
So from my perspective, I've been working with the community independents around the country, and 37 of them ran in electorates across the country. So for me, the most outstanding thing that I watched was 37 communities take an active part in citizenry. They found their candidates and then they got out and they campaigned. Now, not all of them won in the sense of getting their candidate up, but the fact that 37,000 people got out there in orange and other coloured shirts and said, we don't want what you're offering us. We want something better, and we are going to work for it. We're going to volunteer for it. Now, not many people saw that because it didn't get reported in the big battle between the two, the duopoly, but that's what I saw. And then the thing that happened was the mobile phone went off as one after the other. They expressed their joy and their excitement and the fun of managing community campaigns. where you get 25, 35, 50% of the vote. So what I saw was joy, excitement and delight in being Australian.
Thomas, what did you see?
Oh, you can imagine how happy I was seeing Peter Dutton get an absolute hiding. I was very happy. I just saw the numbers rolling in, and it was just joy for me. I'm glad that, firstly, I think it was a rejection of his nastiness over, a long period of time. And so I saw Australians responding to that, responding to the fears of, Trumpism. And I'm glad that that Peter Dutton used the voice in these sort of last 24 hours of his campaign, and talking about that, just the constant sort of attack on Indigenous people, that was his style of politics. I'm glad he used that in the last 24 hours and then got so soundly rejected, because I think it gives a mandate now to fight against the rubbish that, we shouldn't be talking about Indigenous people having rights or recognition.
Judith, what struck you?
Well, look, I think the two big takeouts for me were the collapse of the coalition vote, or the Liberal Party vote, actually, because the National Party vote didn't collapse in the same way. And thinking what a terrible position they're in. I can't see how they're going to rebuild, which is really what they're going to have to do if they're going to stay in the race as a party of government. So that was the first thing. And I think the second was that around a third of the electorate, maybe slightly more, voted for neither of the major parties. Now, that didn't mean that we ended up with as diverse and big a crossbench, I think, as some of us had expected. But that vote, which has gone from the major parties, yes, it flowed back to Labor this time, but it's not exactly a rusted-on Labor vote. So, and young people in particular are not voting for the major parties in the proportions that certainly their grandparents did. And so it's a very unstable electorate, it seems to me, that we can see, which is a real challenge, I think, for this Labor government.
I was really struck during the whole campaign about what was missing. And there are three subjects I thought each of you could speak to one of them. And they're three huge subjects. The first being, even though Peter Dutton did mention it the night before, Indigenous affairs seemed very absent from this entire campaign, as did climate change and tax reform. And they were such startling absences for me. And I wondered how we can have such a disconnect between issues that are so important to so many people and our leaders during an election campaign. Do you want to go first, Thomas?
Yeah, I think for all three, it's I guess a fear of losing votes if they, because of so much noise from the flooding the zone with shit Trump-style tactics. And that was the case with the lack of Indigenous policy. It absolutely was missing, and it was like it was something that Labor ran 100 miles from after the referendum, and that was a real disappointment. It was a disappointment when they basically withdrew support from what the Uluru Statement from the Heart called for, which was a Makarrata Commission for truth-telling and agreement-making, truth-telling and agreement-making. But I think there was a miscalculation from Labor, in my opinion. I don't think that if they had stood firm and stared down Peter Dutton after the referendum, and Senator Price, who were, continually attacking any mention of something positive about Indigenous affairs, I don't think they would have lost any votes for it. And so that miscalculation, I really wish that they would have stood firmer on that. They've won by a landslide now, and I hope that they find their backbone in this. But it's going to depend on us, Australian people, who I think a majority of Australian people still want change, still want to see the gap closed, and still have an appetite for some visionary policy on this. We have to make ourselves loud and be heard on this together.
Judy, do you think Labor would have won if they'd come to the election with a tax policy?
Well, the thing about the tax policy is that what we really have is a revenue problem. So, in my view, we need tax reform, which will mean that some people and some sectors are going to have to pay more tax. And I think after the 2019 election, when they did go with some ways of increasing revenue to that election, with Bill Shorten as leader, and they lost, I think it's made them very cautious. But with the deficit we've got, and with the increasing bill for the NDIS and for aged care, and also the cost of the energy transition, the government actually needs to work out some ways of raising some more revenue. So I'm sort of hoping that because they've got such a big majority, they may be a little bolder. But on the other hand, Albanese looks like he doesn't want to move much beyond what he's promised in the election, And I mean, my sense is that Chalmers would be bolder, but he won't be able to push. Will he be able to push Albanese?
It's a lot of caution, isn't it? That you're talking about with both these issues, politicians, they're just too frightened to bring anything. Yeah,
because if you raise taxes, I mean, one easy thing to do would be to increase the GST by a couple of %, which would, and there could be compensatory mechanisms for people that really hurts. It might give them enough money to do something about the New Start allowance, which is really a disgrace that a country as rich as this, is not doing anything. So, there's a lot of good things that could be done with a bit more revenue, and there's a lot, like when I still buy weekend papers, legacy media, and they're
very grateful to you, Judy.
And most of the biggest amount of advertising is for cruises.
It's for what?
For cruises.
Oh, yeah.
Now these are very expensive. There's obviously, it's a lot of people who can afford to go on cruises. Well, they could afford to pay more tax. It seems to me they can afford to go on cruises.
Cathy, climate change was the other glaring hole. And, of course, the Teals run on that. That's been a sort of foundation policy, hasn't it? Do you think that the absence of that policy affected the Teals? Was it a problem?
Well, I actually don't think it's correct to say they didn't. The coalition had a policy for climate change, and it was called nuclear power. So I think it would be a mistake to say that it wasn't there and it was front and centre, and they lost their courage on it because the response was so bad. And in the debate we're having now about who gets to lead the coalition, they're having a huge discussion about what they're going to do with nuclear. So I don't think it's right to say it wasn't there. I think it was, and I think it got soundly rejected. I think that's part of why people didn't vote for that. So I think that's one thing. But just talking about what I call the community independence, it's much bigger than the Teals. It's, there's a whole lot of people involved in this community base. And climate is not only central, but when the sector that I'm particularly interested in is rural and regional Australia and how we manage this transition. So, and there's very poor policy on transition. And I'll just tell you a quick story if I could, because if we don't do it better, we are going to be in big trouble. So it's not just climate change policy, it's actually how it impacts on our lives. So in a small community near me, there was a very, very hotly contested argument about batteries going into prime agricultural land. And the process was appalling. The people who sold the land got money, the neighbours didn't get money, the community weren't engaged, but they get the batteries. Anyhow, the process is appalling. It hasn't finished. And the people who are engaged in that have led a community reaction against it. And as I was handing out how to vote cards in my electorate, the others were absolutely committed to the coalition, because the coalition came in and said, we won't have batteries on prime agricultural land. Now, that's not the answer. The answer is really good process that engages communities and ensures that communities reap benefits from the transition. But the nation does not have policy around that. So we've got this transition happening, but we've got no policy around how there's going to be benefit, who gets the benefit, and how it's going to be distributed for the longer term. So that was, in my electorate, hotly argued. And the divisive nature, I'm going to say it didn't get picked up by the national press because it's so local, but the incredibly divisive way the coalition wedged the community around that. It was salutary to see, but a lesson to us that if we don't manage the disaffection that comes from no tax policy, if we don't manage the disaffection that comes from an unfair tax policy, if we don't manage the disaffection that comes from a very unfair transition to net zero, people will say no. And there will be massive demonstrations around the country. And I don't see anyone in politics putting their attention to solving that divide. Look, we can see it happening, but who is even having any discussion around how we bring people together around this? And it's not just a country thing. Any of you from Sydney, the coast north from Sydney up that coast, the PEP 11, a huge argument about what was going to happen out in the sea. So I just think there's not just those three areas, there's just a huge discussion we need to have as a nation about how we handle difference. And if we polarise it, we get stuck. So what I'm really looking for is this current government, now it's got such a mandate, is to actually start engaging with its citizenry in how we want to be, as opposed to polarising us and dividing us.
Just want to share an experience in that vein. I'm a national official for the Maritime Union of Australia, and we have offshore wind is really important to us, and it's just one of those types of divisive campaigns that we run against that. I think it's important, like for our members, offshore wind is really important because it's a transition from ships servicing oil and gas to ships servicing the offshore wind farms. And so there's a transition there. We've had to do the work to explain that to the members, though, and we've seen, though, a big difference where the government has done a good job at bringing the community along to where it's been lacking, and the ability then for bad actors to use that, for destructive political actions. Yeah.
I want to pick up on the couple of things you just said, Kathy. One of them is the localness and I want to ask Judy about how much local life matters in changing national politics.
Well, I've been thinking about this. What the notion of citizenship that is now dominant is where we think of ourselves as citizens in relationship to the nation state or to the state, and it's tied up with notions of rights citizens of Australia. But there was an older concept of citizenship, which was really about the way you engaged with your community, and so it seems to me that it's the strength of local community organisations that's what holds the nation together in some ways, or that where people are engaged. And then we've got the states in the middle, and so a lot of this, I think, it's not just about how the citizenry engages, but these are very difficult policy questions, and there's conflicting interests. It's not as if the community all thinks the same. That's the problem. We know that, and politics is about managing conflict and coming to some sort of a workable outcome. I don't know whether that's quite answering your question, but I think it's easy to think that somehow more community engagement is going to be the answer, because there's gains and losses in many policy outcomes, and the people who are losing are going to complain. I mean, the one, though, more positive outcome, I think, is that the Nationals in particular thought that the politics of division around transmission lines and wind farms and things was going to help them and help the coalition, and it clearly didn't. And so maybe they'll back off on trying to fuel these sort of local grievances and local conflicts. But the thing is, I suppose, there's going to be losses, and that's a difficult thing for political elites to manage.
I think, Cathy, you also mentioned, the idea of people will protest, people will march, but I don't know, it takes a lot to get Australians marching these days, it feels. Maybe that's just compared to times past. Thomas, you've written a book about what needs to happen when your cause fails, how you pick yourself up, and what do you think, what are the things that can be done when you want to get your cause back on the agenda?
Yeah, well, after the referendum, there was a lot of heartbreak, and what I did was I decided to write. I wrote an article for the Saturday paper that came out a week after the referendum, and in that writing, it's such a great thing to help frame things in your mind and understand, analyse your thoughts and feelings, and I thought about what we have done as Indigenous people throughout a long history of being told no. I was reminded of that resilience, the ability to find hope even in the darkest times. I thought about how, the right to vote was rejected a number of times before we achieved that. Equal wages was rejected a number of times before we achieved it, but eventually we did get a yes, in a sense. And so I think the first thing I did with this book, was to remind people of that history of being knocked back and standing up again and keeping on going. And what I used to, I think, help people to understand it was to talk about hope, and to talk about hope as energy, and what we could do is understand where we can draw that energy from to keep going. For me, my family, my community, I write about enjoying going fishing with them after being away for, so many months of that year. That was where I found that source of energy to keep going and to write this book, really. And part of hope is also, I think, understanding that history, but also being able to imagine the world as it isn't right now. I think that's how we get community, these community independents up. We explain that the major parties aren't doing it, but this is how we can do better. And so when people understand how they can be motivated and then what they can do with that motivation, that's when you get change. And that's what I wrote about in the first part of that book.
Judith, you're an historian. How is national identity created?
That's a big question.
You're a big person, big brain.
At the end of last century, I was involved in a project called Ordinary People's Politics, where we interviewed about 70 people with long qualitative interviews, I should say, about, and they were very long form interviews. And one of the things we were asking them about was, what does Australia mean to you? And what came through was that Australia is it's slippery. I mean, it can mean the nation, it can mean the country, it can mean the land, and it means different, people migrated at different times. Some of them, people's sense of history often starts when their forebear gets off the boat, or when they get off the boat, or the aeroplane now, I should say. So I think one is that at the moment, in the last 20 years, Australia has changed a lot. It's become more diverse than it was. We know we've had a post-war migration program going since the Second World War, but it's really ratcheted up in the last 20 years, and it's a rapidly changing country. I just went to hear Cos Samaras, and he was saying, well, there's 1 million Indians living in Melbourne now. Now, it wasn't the case 20 years ago. So it's something that's evolved. But I think my understanding when I think about it is it's a common fate. There's something that we share by being on this landmass, really, in our particular geographic, relatively isolated position. And because of the sort of unique features of this very dry continent, it's why many of us, I think, feel that climate change is such, it looms in our fears about the future. But it's that sense of a common fate, I think, that I think of as what being a member of a nation means.
Now, can I just value, I've just finished reading your lovely book about Deakin, and he was a native-born Australian, and he had a vision for us as a nation, and I loved watching how the political processes came together and to build that nation. So I just wanted to advocate for that book if you're looking for it. But the other thing about a nation is, so I live near Albury-Wodonga, and after the election result on Saturday night, I just think the universal refrain was, aren't you proud to be Australian? We knew we had done something really good, and we were so surprised that collectively as a nation we had done the right thing, And it was, you go out for coffee up the street and people say, gosh, aren't we good? Aren't we good? Aren't we clever? Look what happened. Look at this, look at that, look at something else. So I was surprised by that because there was a real national, I don't know, Melbourne, I'm presuming because the way you're laughing, it was probably here too, but it was that sense that we could have gone down this track that the referendum could have taken us down. The country could have gone and said, yeah, we want more of that. But no, we didn't, did we? No, we said we want to be something else, and we're not quite sure of what that something else is. I don't think, from my perspective, it's an absolute saying we want to all be the red wave, or we want to be all. I don't think it was that. I just think it was a real clear we don't want to be that. And I think for the Prime Minister now, and part of the Labor Party's job, is to actually take that confidence and actually help us be nation building with the really diverse immigration that we've had over the last period of time. I don't know actually what the figure is, you probably do, of the percentage of Australians who have been born overseas. It's a huge percentage.
Or got an overseas-born parent.
It's big.
About 50%
Yeah.
now.
So we're no longer the colonial British community that we were. We're actually a very different nation. And I really am looking forward to looking at our institutions to modernise them and Australianise them in a way. And I just thought that result on Saturday night was just a collective sigh of relief, but also a sigh of just, we're not going to do that. What do you reckon, Tom?
Yeah. Look, and I said how joyful I was because I feel like we were at a crossroads. If we had have gone down the path that Dutton wanted to take us down, it was a much darker place. And I was just joyful because he got no political reward for what he did, which was really against the national interests and was really dishonest. After all of the work that had been done toward that opportunity that we had as Australians. And so I was very joyful about that. But at the same time, and to talk about, you know, what were your words again? A common fate. In the back of my mind, at the same time, it's a knowledge that that's not really the case when it comes to Australia's First Peoples. You know, we've had 3 years of Labor government. We've had the closing the gap measures are hardly improving still. In the Northern Territory, where I'm from, almost all of the children in youth detention are Indigenous. We've had, I think it's increased by 4 times the amount of people that are on remand. We know that that's almost all Aboriginal, you know, Indigenous people. The life expectancy gap isn't improving. So I'm sorry to put a dampener on it, but, you know, we need to do better. We must do better because it's shameful that this country has proportionately the most incarcerated people on the planet. And so that is something that we should all have in our mind. I think what really makes us unique as a country and what we missed the opportunity to solidify in our founding document in the referendum was embracing that 60,000 years of continuous culture and heritage. And that would have been, I think, so important to our future. We can't give up on that. But I think about it like this, you know, like we talk about what makes us uniquely Australian. And we talk about thongs or, you know, a shrimp on the barbie or going to the beach. Like so many other countries enjoy those things. What makes us unique is our Indigenous culture and heritage. And we need to embrace it.
I don't want to put a dampener on it either, but obviously, you know, when Scott Morrison won his miracle election, there was an even greater proportion than Labor voters this time who were like, thank God the country got it right, literally thanking God that the country got it right. And which, you know, that we're not... we have divisions, obviously, in Australia, some pretty sharp ones at times. But I wonder if, as a collective, we're less prone to some of the nastiness that can come from that. Things like we're seeing in the United States, things that we're seeing in Europe. Is there something in our citizenry that we have our vote at the ballot box, we cheer on if our guy won, and we get on with it in the main, or are the seeds of that deeper division here like anywhere else?
Well, look, I think that institutions matter on this, and you know, we're blessed with a fantastic electoral system. And I think because we've all been paying more attention to the United States with its disastrous results, people are much more aware of the fact that, you know, we have compulsory voting and preferential voting, which pulls people into the middle and which doesn't reward extremism. And we have the Australian Electoral Commission to run our elections, who are non-partisan. So I think it's important. And I also think that there's a level of Australians being polite, you know, in public. Maybe, I mean, you're saying that not all the time.
No, I'll tell you. I mean, for all the things that were thrown at me in the referendum, if you were to believe social media, you'd think people are throwing, you know, rotten tomatoes at me on the street. I only got abused on the street twice in all this time. Yeah. You know, there was so much more love out there than that. And yeah, so.
But the other thing I was going to say, Sally, and it sort of follows on from what Thomas is saying, but the increasing inequality in Australia, which is coming up in the figures, I think is a big danger sign for us. And a lot of it is generational. The fact that younger people really feel cut out and denied the sort of future that they'd been brought up to imagine themselves. And I think that's, you know, Labor was a social democratic party. It was committed to more equality. Now it's adopted the language of aspiration as well now. But the no one left behind, which Albanese says, I mean, that has to be taken seriously. And I think one of the huge bad legacies of John Howard's government is the inequality in our education system, and there's money poured into the rich private schools. And so that again is so there's some things that are entrenching inequality at the moment that I think really have to be tackled.
In the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, you write about this in Democracy Sausage, Australia was a great laboratory for reform, democratic reform. And I wonder how much of that was a top-down process of change, or if it was, compared to some of the social change now that seems more community-led, something like the same-sex marriage plebiscite, and even climate change, where politicians have just been dragged kicking and screaming to these policies. In the past, was change led in? Did it come from within the power structure?
I think it varies. Much of the electoral reform of the middle of the 19th century, like manhood suffrage, the secret ballot, was driven by the sort of Chartist ideas of the gold rush immigrants, and it was widely popular. Similarly, I think the votes for women, federation had a degree of popular support, but I think that there's periods when the political elite is ageing and out of touch with there's social change happening and there's a political elite, and there's various moments when I think the political elite gets right out of kilter. And I think I was thinking about this morning in preparation for this afternoon, thinking, well, the 1949 election, which Menzies won and which was a transformative election, Labor was still really running on the policies that had come out of the Depression, and there was a whole influx of returned servicemen and women who were wanting to really push into the future, and a lot of younger members of Parliament got in at that 49 election. Now, the problem was they were still there in the 1960s, along with Menzies, and the society was changing under it. And when I was writing about Menzies, I mean, for my generation, he just seemed like this frozen Edwardian. I mean, he was just holding up all the changes. America had had Kennedy, and Britain had had Harold Wilson, and we had Menzies, But then, and so Whitlam was again transformative, where there was an influx of new energy. Now, I'm not sure at the moment whether we've quite, I feel like Albanese's quite old.
He's not that old.
No, I mean, he's not as old as me, but
there's something about that I'd just like to throw into the discussion. I was just reading it the other day. It's in the Labor caucus. The left wing of the Labor caucus, the left Labor caucus, has got more women in it than men, and they're young.
Yeah.
And I just thought, whoa, that's going to be fascinating, as that group of younger women with they're left in the caucus.
Yeah, but they might be old by the time they lead, Cathy.
Well, yeah. But they also might be incredibly powerful in the social revolution of the...
But also the Greens have got young people. I mean, I think, I thought Max Hyphenator... Chandler was really a breath of fresh air. And I know he went a little bit far and everything, but to actually have the voice of a young person and coming with different social experiences into the Parliament, I thought was terrific. And I thought it was very bad of Albanese to attack him in the way he did. I thought that was a sign of there being people who were shaped by different social experiences, thinking that somehow they were still... that was all there was, or that was still the centre. So I think I think it shifts, but I think we're at an interesting moment now of generational shift, where the baby boomers are, they're only going to be 25% of the electorate at the next election, and the people sort of under 50 are going to be 50%. So there's going to be, it's quite dynamic.
Kathy, you've seen how the sausage is made. What is it like up there? Canberra? Do you feel? Did you get the impression that the politicians there feel the weight of citizenry upon them? I don't know if it's something I'm making sense with.
Look,
but
I wonder, that question's I often get asked it and I find it really hard to answer because I can't generalise about others. I was elected with a very specific task in 2013 to represent my community. So I went to Canberra to do that. It was a job and I knew what the job was and I set about doing it. So I paid enough attention to the environment to be able to use it to my ends, if that makes sense. I needed to get mobile phone towers for my community. I needed to get the train that was faster in Ned Kelly's time fixed up. I really needed to get re-elected. And I needed to do that, the community needed to trust me. So Parliament became a theatre for me to do the work in the first term. So I set about using every skill I had within that work environment, and I didn't make any effort to understand the work environment other than to use it. Like I didn't want to change it. That was the first, and people would constantly say to me, what's it like to be there? And I would laugh and say, well, I'm a country woman, I'm an older country woman. I have worked in this environment of the patriarchy all my life. I know how to work it, and I will work it. So it was a very pragmatic approach. Now, the second term, when I got re-elected with a much bigger majority and I felt more confident, I then set about, well, how to make a sausage, and in particular for rural and regional Australia, how to use the processes to do that. And I just fell in love with the system. I found the rules easy to understand. I found the relationships really easy to build. And I loved working in Parliament. Now, that's got nothing to say for the people in the parties, because I was never in a party. I was a self-employed, charismatic woman who could walk through Parliament, smile at everybody and work the system, if you could imagine that. And there was no one telling me I couldn't do it. And in fact, so I was able to, and this is what I think about what being an independent's about, is if you're an independent, you can do that. If you're a party member, 1, you pay money to belong to a party. 2, you have to follow the rules. And 3, there's a hierarchy. And 4, you get kicked out. And if you get in and then you get kicked out, you've got no power base. You can't get anything done. So I had the power base of my community and I was just a clever community organiser. Now, so the answer to the question was how the sausage was made was never a problem for me because I went about working my community to work it out. And I'll just give a quick example. So we needed to get new mobile phone towers. North East Victoria, once you get up the Hume Highway, all those valleys, there was almost no coverage and no internet. So what we did in the communities, we had a big meeting and we got all the local governments together and we got an agreement of the 9 local governments, where did we need these mobile phone towers? So that we got on-ground community agreement, and then my job was to go and find where the money was in Parliament, which I did, and then the community came to Canberra and they lobbied for it. So my job was a facilitator of it, and we worked like that. And a good community operator in Parliament can work the system. And we did exactly the same thing for the beginning of the integrity legislation that Helen Haynes ended up producing. So I just found being an independent, an older woman independent, Parliament was a blissful place to work. It had really good rules. For the staffers and others, it was not so good. But in our area that we were working, it was. And the most satisfying thing about the job was the community loved it. So you'd go up the street and people say, oh, so good having you there. I saw your speech. It was great. Did this, do that. And then you'd have the school kids come in and they go, oh, that's fantastic. I see how it works. So the ability to actually be excited about the system that we live in and the institutions, and that 99.9% of the time they work, and then explain that to a community that they can influence it, and this is how you influence it, was blissful. So that's why I'm such a dedicated person for community independence, because you talk about the teal, all that crossbench feel the same way. They all love the job and they want to do more of it. The people who complain are those stuck in the parties. And they go, it's all right, it's horrible, it's nasty. They're, no. I go, yeah, that's right, it is, You've made the wrong decision there. You should, if you're interested in politics and you're interested in doing really good stuff for your community, then being at community independence is the way to do it.
Yeah, but we have to have ministers. I mean, we've got to have a government, We can't, if
I know you do, but
just...
I have to say, after the 2022 election, Malcolm Turnbull got on the phone, he says, Cathy, I go, yeah, Malcolm. And he said, how do we get some of those, Allegra Spender, how do we get some of those women as ministers? And I said, well, there's nothing stopping them being ministers. And if the prediction had come up that we'd had a minority government, some of those crossbenchers would have been offered ministers' positions. There's no reason why you can't be a minister on the crossbench. Absolutely. South Australia's done it regularly. It happens. It's a way of, if you want to manipulate the numbers, that's what you do.
Thomas, your ambition with The Voice is much more complicated than windmills in a local community, partly because you can't have the luck of getting your representative elected and off to Canberra, and you're looking at a nationwide, lots of little communities. How do you approach your task? What are the things that have to be done?
Well, I mean, Indigenous people are having this discussion right now. It's not only up to the government to, we can't leave it to them to come up with visionary policies. They certainly haven't. We've got to come together again and have that discussion. And that's very difficult. It takes resources to do that on a national basis. So we've got those great challenges. But I can guarantee everybody that is something that people that you see as Indigenous leaders are talking about that now. I just wanted to say a little bit more on what Cathy was saying as well, if that's all right. Please. I think the community independence, so people that are genuinely, being elected and genuinely representing their electorates, is a breath of fresh air for democracy. I think it strengthens our democracy, and we need people to be inspired by the ability of our institutions to deliver for them. I think that the way that we go down the Trump path is if our politicians, our parliament continues to fail in that area and people start to fall down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. But that goes another way as well, without being naive, I think it's important that we have some faith in our institutions too. I've been thinking about, we probably hear it around the barbecue or whatever, or having a cuppa and someone says, or you see it on social media a lot, that you can't trust any politicians and they're all rotten and they're all corrupt. And often I think you'll nod your head and say, yeah, mate, yeah, right. But I think that's not completely true. And it's just something I've been thinking about lately, that we need to also have faith in ourselves and our fellow citizens as well.
And as I say, I think one of the real strengths of the community independence is that the range of backgrounds and occupations that they've come from. Because one of the things that's been happening with both of the major political parties is that their recruitment into, and the pre-selection processes have been recruiting basically party operatives. And so we've been ending up with this political class, if you like, or politicians who really do feel out of touch. And so there was some truth in the idea of the Canberra bubble did capture something. But when we have people like you and Monique Ryan and Allegra Spender who've come from have got a lot of different occupational experience that they're bringing and real life experience. I mean, I also think it's quite good for people to go in, in middle age rather than when they're in their 20s and 30s. And we can talk old. About Sam Ray, who's just been used to bump Mark Dreyfus, which I think is a bad move. So I think that's one of the reasons that people were saying, politicians, then was because there was so much of this recruitment from within the parties and the community. And I think one of the reasons Labor's did better this time is that they learnt the lesson from Fowler when they tried to put Christina Keneally in and really lost, is that they're paying a little bit more attention to their pre-selection.
Yeah, certainly in Queensland they did a great job there.
Yeah.
I'm a member of the Labor Party, but I'm a member because I don't like those, career politicians that aren't really going in with, they've got a political career in mind, not what they want to deliver for the Australian people.
And they don't have a broad enough experience for when they're coming to difficult policy decisions to be able,
And something that I encourage in my book, I think we, as difficult as it is in those parties, because they're big machines and you can lose it's very, very difficult work. But I think more of us should get engaged in politics. More of us should get engaged in supporting someone good in your electorate, or even joining a party, being part of those branch meetings and being part of pre-selections and that.
And the parties, the major parties are going to have a terrible time trying to do that now, though. I can't. And what you just said, Thomas, about most politicians are pretty decent, and that's my experience too. I've interviewed so many of them. There's only 2 I've ever really disliked, and the rest of them are usually much better in person than they are in public, and presumably do that kind of.
I'm not sure about most, actually.
Community work. It has been my experience. But then it's always better to interview them when they've retired, because they relax and they tell you what they really think, which they may be doing at a local level too, more with their constituencies. But I mean, Judy, can you imagine a sort of scenario where young people suddenly start joining political parties again?
Not really. No, I mean, but because it's not just political parties that people don't join. That they don't join churches. They're not joining trade unions. But on the other hand, there's a lot of organised sport going on. It's not that there's no joining of things. Like one of the great strengths of Helen Garner's book, The Season, is it captures something that happens nightly and Saturday mornings when there's these community-run sporting groups. And so there's a lot of volunteering that is still going on. But when the parties did have strong branches, it was when people lived more intensely in geographical communities. But now with cars and with the internet, people's social worlds are sort of much more dispersed. So, but on the other hand, it does seem as if young people will mobilise around issues in a way that perhaps it's harder for them to join the political parties. But I mean, I haven't joined a political party, so.
I want to ask you about Beatrice Faust, because she started the Australian Women's Electoral Lobby.
Yeah.
She started it from her kitchen. I mean, this really was a sort of original.
It was in the lounge room.
It was in the lounge room in Carlton, a group of women, a small group of women that started the very, very simple idea of interviewing every federal politician to see what their policies or their views about women and policy affecting women were. Very simple idea. And it's still going today. Is that kind of an idea still possible now?
Well, I mean, I think the thing with history is you really don't know until it happens. I think the thing with the Women's Electoral Lobby was it really took off and it surprised Beatrice. I mean, she had a more modest set of ideas about a way of lobbying politicians, the parliamentarians who would make the law. But because of the frustrations that many well-educated women were finding that, that they were having to leave their jobs when they got married, or that contraception was very difficult to get, or that they had difficulties getting loans to start a business. There was all sorts of frustration. So it captured a moment, and it captured a moment when there was this momentum for change coming up with Whitlam leading, the It's Time election. Now, those things can happen again, but you can't really predict them, I don't think.
Do you think...
But we couldn't have predicted Cathy.
No.
And she started, showed that a community independent, it was possible to win. And that's led to, a flourishing of community independence.
I want to ask each of you, as our time is rapidly disappearing, if you think our national identity, our collective identity, along with our institutions, but particularly our identity, how it holds up, how do you think it might hold up to the pressures that are going on in the world at the moment? The threats to democracy, the threats to social cohesion. Is there anything distinctively Australian other than what you've already pointed out, Thomas, or including what you've pointed out with Indigenous people, that can sort of give us a safe harbour from those forces? Cathy?
I think I really like what you were saying, Judith, about our institutions, the uniquely Australian institutions that we've got and how we evolve them. That's one thing. But there's something else that I really liked about Australia. And it was sort of like, what's the first thing that the Prime Minister's which is the first country the Prime Minister's going to visit? It's Indonesia. I was so pleased to hear that. I just thought, yes, we belong, he got the geography right. And there was something about our geography that you're talking about, our space, that's really important to me. So the question that you ask is, what is it about our national identity? And I like it that we're evolving to reach out to Southeast Asia and claiming our space in this geography, because I feel I belong in the world to the Southern Pacific, and Indonesia is my neighbours, and Papua New Guinea. I belong in this collective, and I'm really glad that there are a lot of Indians coming to Australia, because I love India. I love that they're part of my ecosystem. So I really like that as a nation we're claiming our sort of geography space. Now, I'm not quite sure what we do with that, but we're not American and we're not English and we're not European, even though there's a lot of that in us. We're actually here. So that's my long answer to that question.
I think what I'd say, Sally, is Australians like to imagine that somehow we're being buffeted by the same things as the world, but after last Saturday, I don't think there is a crisis of democracy in Australia at the moment, So...
No, I don't. I wasn't suggesting that there is.
So, it doesn't... there's obviously huge problems that have to be dealt with and things, but essentially the place... the centre seems to be holding. The place seems to be holding, and I think that the rejection of the faux strong leader that Dutton presented himself, there was all that chest beating and I'm strong and I'll stand up to Trump and I'll do this, but there was no substance apart from a certain nastiness. The rejection of that, I think, augurs well for the near future, so long as Labor's able to hang on to that.
And it doesn't worry you that some of the institutions that we depend on and we talk about with such pride, like compulsory voting and the Australian
I don't think there's any threat to any of that.
It doesn't matter that they're not they're legislated, but we're not bound to them.
Yeah, but no politician's going to try to dismantle those.
Good. Thomas?
No, better
We've
not.
got to be vigilant about that. I've probably seen more of this country, you know, in the 6 years that I was just full-time campaigning for the Uluru Statement and into the referendum than most Australians by far. And it's this continent that we all share, this place that we all share is just so beautiful. You know, there is so much diversity. And as I mentioned, even in the hardest part of that campaign, with all of the rubbish that was on social media and the mainstream media, there was more love out there than hate. There was more acceptance for a person that would turn up and do a town hall and have a yarn than there was rejection in that way. I hardly left this country in that time, especially in the last couple of years. It was all here in Australia. And now when I go overseas, I find that I miss home immediately. I miss it so much. And that's not because I'm an Indigenous person. I don't know what it is exactly, but I just miss home so much, probably because I've seen so much of it and I feel so connected to so many great Australians across the country, you know. And so I just can't wait to get home when I go overseas now. And it's partly because I feel safer here too, you know, with everything that's going on in the world. All I would say, I think it's all been said, the answer to that question. I'd just add that we cannot take those things for granted. The institutions that were mentioned, our democracy, we cannot take those things for granted, and we've got to be vigilant. And I am so glad that we didn't choose that other path on the 3rd of May.
Well, we're going to wind it up. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling very grateful that we have people like you three who actually do things. I was listening to a really interesting interview on Late Night Live the other night about sort of moral employment and that people who actually do things with their careers that are useful and a real contribution. And I feel like we've been so lucky to have the three of you here to talk together, very different perspectives today. They will all go and sign books and answer questions. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you all have a great rest of the Writers' Festival. Thank you again to Wheeler Centre, and thank you all for being a fabulous audience. It's been terrific. Thanks.